Hi everyone, my name is Anthony Smart. I'm a lecturer in ancient and early medieval history here at York St John University. And what I want to talk about today is the demise and the fall of the Roman Republic. This may be a topic that you will be familiar with or have some understanding of already. But what I want to do today is to encourage us to think in a slightly different way about the demise of the Roman Republican form of governance from the 2nd through to the 1st century BC, and be led at all stages by the contemporary evidence, by the primary writings, those contemporary voices that speak to the changes in the political, the social, the economic, but also the cultural experiences of Rome in this period. This is a topic that has attracted significant debate, both from the ancient right through to modern day, and there are many different ways of approaching this topic. We could do so from a political focus by looking at and thinking in detail about the nature of the Republic, the political structures, but also the wider political understanding governing the demise of this form of government. Alternatively, we could think about society, how society perhaps gives the illusion of not changing at all, but actually is changing in rather profound and deeply affecting ways. Likewise, we could consider an economic study, a study perhaps of different elements within the wider imperial republic. But there are many different approaches we could take, and there are many different dates, for instance, we could use to mark the final point of the Roman Republic. Does it simply end when Augustus assumes power and control and installs himself deeply within the Roman imperial, the Roman governmental system? Or has it already ended? Has it ended, for instance, when Sulla twice marched his armies upon the city of Rome? Quite famously, it was alleged that Sulla strengthened the Roman Senate, but as Catherine Steele has recently argued, that argument in and of itself does not necessarily stand up. That perspective can and perhaps should be challenged. So what I want us to be aware of before I begin talking about the Republic and its eventual demise is that this is a topic that has attracted controversial comment, but also significant discussion amongst both contemporaries as well as modern scholars. A good place to begin, I think, is in trying to understand actually what it is we're talking about. And to give an idea of the Roman Republic, I thought we might begin in 216 BC, and this is quite famously the year of the Battle of Cannae. This takes place on the 2nd of August, and there are many different interpretations of potential numbers of soldiers killed here on the Roman side, 50,000, 70,000, or considerably more. The reason I begin here is because it tells us a few things we just need to be aware of when we think about the Roman Republic. First, that any other ancient city-state facing a defeat of the scale that Rome endured upon the field of Cannae against the tactical genius of Hannibal would have sued for peace, and indeed it looks as though Hannibal himself expected the Roman Republic to make offers towards peace. But crucially, everyone, that did not take place. And instead what Rome did is they returned to their sense of identity, they focused upon their own resolve, and they simply raised yet more armies to defend the Republic, to defend their lands, to defend their allies. They also cocooned themselves within their religious devotion, and certain sources, for instance, indicate that as a consequence of Cannae, certain individuals were buried alive to try and guarantee the gods' favour in their upcoming battles. And the reason I want to begin with this is because it presents in one way the way in which perhaps the Roman mentality was very different to our own. In another sense, what it also indicates quite clearly is the Roman sense of purpose, identity, but also, more broadly speaking, a Roman sense of destiny. What the Republic does not do here is bow its head. It does not sue for peace. It continues to fight, and ultimately Rome is victorious over its great imperial rival Carthage. And that is achieved in many ways because of the nature of the Republic, but also crucially the nature of Roman identity. When we talk about Rome, we tend to find ourselves dragged almost uncomfortably into notions of civilization. And of course, this in many ways is a loaded term. It's one that can carry with it both positive and negative connotations. When we consider Roman civilization and whatever we really mean by that, we're not necessarily talking about a distinctive cultural civilization in the manner perhaps of the Greek city-states. Instead, what we're really engaging with is the term itself, civilization, which comes from civis, so it comes from the Latin, it comes from Rome itself, and it carries with it that notion of Roman citizenship, of belonging to a wider sense of structure that can be political, social, and of course, to a certain extent, cultural as well. It is not a utopia, as many later writers would present or suggest that it was, but what the Roman Republic does, perhaps more than anything, is it successfully transforms Europe into a wider Roman world. In one sense, then, it creates this notion of civilization that perhaps can be exported to increase its own imperial dominion and power. And ultimately, then, if we're thinking about this term and we're focusing on the Republic, civilization then becomes a tool for empire, a mechanism to construct and to build the imperial republic, to build an empire, and indeed the empire that it becomes. Likewise, I suspect most people will be familiar with the notion of SPQR, Senatus et Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome, and that truly mattered during the course of the Republic, the bond between the people and the Senate, a bond that bridged society, but also gave in many ways a clear and strong foundation to the Roman political model. In the same breath, however, when we talk about Roman civilization and we're focusing in on the Republic, we also find ourselves considering their foundation myths. We find ourselves thinking about how they wrote their own history, how they imagined their own history. And if we look here, we see fratricide, we see mass abduction, we see war upon war upon war. And we just need to be aware almost instantly that there is a belligerence within the Republic. And it's a belligerence that doesn't necessarily go away. And while it can be facing outwards to rival powers, city-states, but ultimately to the far distant barbarians and the barbarian peoples, the nations and the tribes, what it can also carry with it is a sense of infighting within the Republic, which can work and does for many years, but also it contains within it the seed perhaps of its own demise. Roman imperialism, crucially, is found within almost the earliest examples of the Republic and the earliest ideas of the Republic. The traditional date for the founding of Rome is somewhere within the region of 754, 753 BC. And the chronology continues. By 509, the kings are cast out of the city and we have the foundation of the Republic itself. 395, the city of Veii is captured. 390, Rome quite famously is sacked by Gallic tribes. And then we have various series of wars, the wars against the Samnites, the wars against Italian peoples, the Punic Wars, the Macedonian Wars, Spain becoming a province in 197, the rebellion of Spartacus, 73 to 71. We have Caesar in Gaul in the 50s BC, and then Caesar crossing the Rubicon in 49, assassinated in 44, and by 27, Octavian becoming, in effect, the ruler of Rome, Rome's first emperor. But if we think about what the Republic is and we try and define and understand it, I think it's best to consider with and to return to the myths and the legends. For Romans in the late Republic, the 8th century foundation date was historical. And what that tells us and what it presents in many ways is how myth and wider religious belief could matter to the Roman Republic. There are different versions of a number of these myths, but again, I suspect a number of you will be familiar with Romulus and Remus. These two young babies cast into the river, discovered by a she-wolf, but not devoured, not attacked, but instead nourished. The she-wolf offers her milk unto these two young babies, and in so doing seems to give to the founder of the Roman Republic, Romulus, some kind of sense of destiny, purpose, but also, of course, a crucial way in which the Romans could then view themselves. They could use these myths as a mirror, and the legend of Romulus, the killing of his brother Remus at his own hand, carry with them important messages for us when we try and understand actually what on earth the Republic really is. This is something that is in no way ignored or hidden in the Roman mindset. Fratricide, the killing of a brother, something contrary to the norms of later Roman society, is nonetheless celebrated. Celebrated, of course, because Romulus is the first of Rome's kings, and there are more that follow. There's also the link to the Iliad and the link we can find to Ilium more generally. The young prince Aeneas, who in Virgil's The Aeneid provides a counterstroke or a counter story to the Iliad and to some extent the Odyssey as well. And what Aeneas offers is a way in which Rome and the Republic could attach themselves to distant Greek history, but also crucially distance themselves as well. And that's really what the myth and the story of Aeneas achieved. This vast, impressive, poetic account, a study of an individual character who placed duty above all else, but also importantly, who has the ability to see into the future, to see actually into Virgil's own immediate surroundings. And he knows, Aeneas knows that the empire is coming, the Principate of Augustus. But again, this is one way in which Rome could define itself. It could look in the mirror and find its own attributes, its virtues, the virtues of republican government, the virtues of actually what it meant to be Rome. And likewise, quite famously, the association with Hercules, partly to do with the 10th labour, the cattle of Geryon, and links then to the geography surrounding the city of Rome itself, but also seen actually in the lived space of Rome, in the temple of Hercules Victor, which was a crucial part of the religious landscape of the ancient city. Alongside this, we have also the rape of the Sabine women, famous moment, again, not ignored by the Roman Republic, but instead used as a defining characteristic of how they understood and seek to understand themselves and their own identity. And then also alongside that, the expulsion of the kings, the revolution against them, and the founding of republican government. I begin with these myths and these ideas because I think they tell us an awful lot actually about the Republic, but also crucially about how the Republic sought to present itself and through that create Roman identity. Romans, broadly speaking, and this is particularly true of the Republic, could move forward at great speed. They could change. But crucially, they could also look backwards, and indeed often did look backwards. Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors, that mattered. And we can see that in the lived architecture of ancient cities, ancient spaces. But we can find it too within houses, dwellings, and writings. The past mattered to Rome, and if that past contained myth alongside history, that doesn't matter, because that is how Rome and the Republic sought to define themselves. Polybius, in his histories, presents us with an image of republican government. He writes that the elements by which the Roman constitution were controlled are 3 in number, and when taken separately, so fairly and so suitably ordered and regulated, can provide, in one sense, a clear depiction of that republican government. And what Polybius was able to recognize is that it presented elements that could look like oligarchy, democracy, but also monarchy. And actually what Rome and its republic really was, in many ways, was a negotiation between different senses of political order, different ambitions of political life, mixed together, sometimes working, but also, of course, exposing issues therein. And if Polybius is right, then Rome itself and the Republic is founded on 3 columns that do not always work necessarily well together. Oligarchy alongside democracy, both alongside monarchy. Roman historians, when they looked back to the foundation of the Republic, presented it as a very strong act of liberation, where tyranny had been destroyed and challenged, monarch ejected from government, but crucially, everyone, the power of the king remained. And that sense of imperium can be seen through the stylings of Roman Republican government, the trappings, the clothing, but also certain rituals and certain behaviors. The toga praetexta, the ceremonial chair, the use of lictors, all of these are echoes of that monarchic past. And indeed, the Senate and how they referred to one another as patres conscripti, conscripted fathers. This is all echoing that. So the early republic, much as we can say anything about it, really seems to be created in one sense by later historical writers, and they present it as emerging pristine, where we have 2 elected consuls now, no more than a year in office. There are various checks and balances. It is oligarchic in one sense. There is this oath made to never take another king. And we have then this notion of a pristine image versus perhaps the reality, because the reality must surely have been rather more complex, embryonic, and not yet fully formed. There are some things we can say. The focus on the city of Rome is important, the role of the ancestors equally so, but even here, differences in social class, differences in political expectations. The image perhaps of the pater familias, the patria potestas, the right of control, an awareness of different elements of Roman society, but also the increasing importance of Roman religion in how they seek to define themselves. So in presenting then an image of republican government, led in part by the ancient material and the ancient evidence, we get an image of, again, you may be familiar with this, the cursus honorum. We get an image of a political ladder of officers, whereby there are meant to be checks and balances between different regions of and different areas of the government, but also a closely controlled pyramid whereby the government is open to a select few, but it is even more closely controlled through age, boundaries, social rank, and things like that. It's very closely controlled and in many ways restrictive. So Roman society then could be regarded, I think, as a structure that was composed in many ways of the rich and their dependent clients, and those clients in turn were duty bound to vote for their patrons. Even at the early stages of republican government, we know that there are issues surrounding debt and land, and these do not in any way, shape or form disappear. So some people, for instance, when they speak about republican government, liken it to a bike race where everyone is traveling at the same speed, working towards the same goal, but only one can actually win, and yet each of them is trying desperately to get to the finish line. That's true of the consuls, that's true of the praetors, that's true of all the other different ranks within the cursus honorum. So I begin then by establishing a sense of the Roman Republic, and even from the early stages and the overview I presented, I think probably what we get a sense of is the way in which the Republic itself sought to present its own image, define itself, provide its own kind of characteristics, but also already there are seeds, not necessarily of its demise, but instead seeds of discontent, elements that were clearly imperfect. Even if the histories are telling us it's all wonderful in the early Republic, we know, of course, that may not necessarily be true. Cicero, in his De Republica, wrote quite famously that as a result, it seems to me that even when Romulus divined that one day the city would provide the seat and home for a very great empire, Summo Imperio, since a city located in any other part of Italy could scarcely have possessed such great power, potentiam, as this. So someone like Cicero, who is in many ways the last great Republican idealist, provides us with a sense of actually how Rome itself not simply could define itself and define the Republican identity, but also, and importantly, believe in that sense of divinity, believe in that sense of destiny, that somehow the Romans and the Roman ideas concerning the birth of the Republic and its sense of self, its sense of identity, could be seen through destiny, that they had a right to rule, and that doesn't really fade away. So if we move on then, everyone, and we think about the demise then of the Roman Republic. There are various points, again, we could enter into this narrative, and I've given you, some of these dates, 27 BC, 44, all the rest. What I think might be most useful is to begin actually now with 49 BC. 49 BC is the year in which Caesar, quite famously and importantly, crosses the Rubicon. And there are different versions of this event, and some of you will be familiar with the potential lines he may or may not have muttered as he did so. Before he crossed those swirling waters, and before he made that fateful decision, the image we have of Caesar is someone who is really struggling with the ramifications of it, and the sense that he knows that if he crosses those waters, he will bring misfortune to all men. But if he does not choose to, he will bring misfortune to himself. And if he does so, then he can no longer function within this wider republican system. The backdrop to Caesar crossing the Rubicon and plunging Rome into this disastrous civil war, but actually, of course, a series of civil wars, is not simply just about the Senate trying to control him and his conflict with the Senate. Instead, what Caesar really is an example of is someone who can embody the destabilizing elements of the late Republic, namely the military potentates, the capacity for individuals to assume vast wealth, huge amounts of wealth, but also through that create their own armies, but also crucially a lack of any kind of centralized control. When Caesar crosses that, he feels he has no choice. His political career would certainly be ruined if he didn't act, and he chooses to act in this way. But also what Caesar is doing here is embodying the decayed fabric of the Roman Republic. It is dignitas, it is honor that causes him to cross those swirling waters. What that means for us when we think about Rome is actually, in pursuing civil war, Caesar presents a difficult dichotomy for the Roman audience. In one sense, Rome can celebrate soldiers who give their lives in service to the Republic, in service to the Imperial Republic, in service, in their words, to their fatherland. It's rather more difficult for them to understand and define, and indeed to depict, Roman soldiers who fall in battle against other Roman soldiers. So some of you may be familiar with, for instance, with Trajan's Column, a wonderfully complex narrative that is achieved through a close study of a single artifact. You're meant to read it almost as a scroll, but it's a wonderful stone column. And what we see there is a celebration of the noble Romans fighting and dying against barbarian forces that otherwise would threaten the Republic itself, or the empire in that instance. When we consider, however, Caesar bringing Roman armies to fight against other rival Roman armies, that poses a quite difficult juxtaposition, a quite difficult sense of unease amongst contemporaries, but also those who come later. And one of the best windows into this is not necessarily Caesar's own writings, but instead Lucan and his epic poem, The Civil War, or the Pharsalia. This was written under the imperial leadership, if we can call it that, of Nero, Emperor Nero. And Lucan originally was actually quite a close confidant of the emperor. He later fell out, was involved potentially in a threat against the emperor's life, and in the end had no other option but to take his own life. And he actually died quite young. But he is, in many ways, not simply just a wonderful poet, but a remarkable literary figure. And he gives us a really interesting but rather disturbing perception of this great civil war, the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, between dictatorship with a question mark and the Senate, again with a question mark. And what he presents is this: that deep blood foams in the water, the waves are choked by clotted gore, and the ships, when hauled by iron chains thrown on board, are kept apart by crowds of corpses. Some sank half dead into the vast deep and drank the sea mixed with their own blood. This is him depicting the Battle of Marseille. But if we look at the poem's other sections, we again get a really strong sense of this. When the dead lie thick upon the field, each death is merged in a common account. Or let our old age look forward to due funeral rites. Civil war can hardly provide graves, even for its leaders. And what Lucan does so well is take the aspects of the Civil War and analyse them through their role to pollute and this idea of pollution. And I think that's a crucial window into the decaying fabric of the Roman Republic. This awareness of a loss of virtue, a lack of morality, but also the actions and the lack of funeral rites, for instance, given to either side, perhaps, speaks of the terrible polluting effects of this conflict, and that Rome itself is completely changed and altered. Even if it is not now a republic, it is not really sure exactly what the future may or may not be. So, for instance, when Lucan writes about the rotting corpses after Pharsalus, he uses language that in many ways is borrowed from the abattoir. Olentes, tabentes, talking about stinking and pestilence and ideas of decay. And he's focusing upon the dead, but also he's speaking then about the nature of the republic, something that now is gone, is rotten, and can no longer return. And actually at one point he writes, "Why do you flee this carnage? Why do you desert these stinking fields? Drink these waters, Caesar. Breathe this air, if you can. But the rotting hordes rob you of Pharsalian fields. They rout the conqueror, and they possess the plain." Lucan is just one example of a Roman source we might use to try and understand the demise of the Republic. There are others we could turn to. We might wish, and I think it'd be useful to do so, to engage with Roman historians, Roman historical writers. One of the greatest of the Roman historians is, of course, Livy, and he began writing in the 30s BC. So he's living through this political turmoil. He's living through the destruction of the Republic and its replacement then with the Principate itself. And what he presents is really, I think, quite peculiar, but also interesting. He suggests a rather profound disgust at the present situation, at the events that are surrounding him. And he also speaks almost of an unwelcome, almost a morbid curiosity on the part of the audience. And what he uses his histories for then is to, almost as a way to escape the contemporary concerns, the contemporary fears, the terrible events all around him. So he seems to look to the past and to imagine the past and to create the past as a way to ignore those terrible realities that are surrounding him, but also all the other figures around him as well. And what he suggests is that actually this is all to do with morality, that the fall of the Republic, the demise of the Republic, is to do with a lack of virtue, a lack of moral fibre. In the early Republic, he argues, there was little wealth, and thus there was little appetite for it. Material prosperity, more land, more money, more slaves, inspired avarice and greed. And he believed that the decadent way of life that he could, for instance, witness around him reflected some kind of self-destructive urge on the part of Rome and its Republic to destroy itself, to destroy themselves. What Livy does not do necessarily is pinpoint when or how. And his solution is to look away from the terrible nature of the present and instead look longingly at the distant past. And so what Livy gives us, for instance, is that really quite polished, varnished image of the early Republic, which may or may not be accurate. I suspect probably not. But nonetheless, he ignores those contemporary concerns. A better guide, if we're trying to think about the demise of the Republic, is someone like Sallust. He's a hugely complex character, very gifted writer, involved in the key events of his day, a follower, for instance, of Caesar. In one sense, his argument and his ideas are rather similar to those we might find in Livy. This is about morality, a lack of moral fibre, a lack of moral constancy, and this is to do with increased wealth. What he also then does is liken this moral decline, this lack of virtue, this erosion of virtue, to a disease. But he's a little bit clearer than Livy in specifying when he thinks this takes place. So he says it's actually 146 BC, the destruction of Carthage. So prior to the destruction of that city, the Roman fear of Punic armies and Punic forces had forced Rome to be virtuous, but also crucially had forced the Romans themselves to be virtuous. But after that, with this vast increase of wealth, the disparity between different social ranks, high living, a lack of moral fibre became the matter of course, became how people simply chose to live. And again, he presents this disgust of the contemporary political scene when I should say he's actually quite heavily involved in it himself. And he gives us an image of this. So in his version of the war against Catiline, he tells us that as soon as the young men could endure the hardships of war, they were taught a soldier's duties in camp under a vigorous discipline, and they took more pleasure in arms and war horses than in any kind of other distraction. To such men, no labour was unfamiliar, no region too rough or too steep, no armed enemy was terrible. Courage was everything, and their most difficult struggle was with one another, because they each strove to be the first to strike down the enemy, to scale a wall, to be seen by all while doing such a deed, and this they considered virtue, this fame, and this high nobility. And then he continues by thinking about Carthage and the way in which growing avarice and the lust for power following the sack of the city, the destruction of that city, began to erode the Roman sense of self. If we step back and think again about poetry, we could consider Horace, who's writing again in the late 30s BC. In his Ode to the Roman People, he presents an image of moral decline, although it's a touch less clear. He likens it to some kind of curse, that the very strength of the state was somehow destroying it. And again, he's engaging with and reflecting contemporary events, the belief that actually self-destruction can be seen, that Rome is willing and able to destroy itself. So what these ancient writings indicate is that moral focus. And while that can still be found in modern historiography and scholarship, it tends to be supplanted with other almost long-term factors. So for instance, and I can talk through a couple of these, political violence, the inability of city-state governance to deal with the imperial republic, the nature of empire, consistent problems surrounding land, army and money, but also the emergence of the military potentates. And these are all, I think, crucial. But what I would urge is to recognize is there must be a reason that ancient writers speak of morality, that they speak of a lost virtue. Something must have happened both within the political structure and the political realities of the Roman Republic, but also within its social and cultural experiences, its social and cultural realities. Something must have happened. And I think the sack of the city of Carthage actually is a useful way to consider this. There are others you will find in trying to understand the demise of the Republic, and a lot of people would speak, for instance, about the Gracchi. The Gracchi were themselves coming from an important senatorial family. We're looking now at the 130s BC and the 120s BC, and we can see here wealth, influence, a sense of glamour perhaps, but also with each of them a very strong indication of talent and a willingness perhaps to change the world and change the Roman world in their mind for the better. What both of these expose is the way in which the Roman Republic was divided between social ranks, but also the issues within the Roman political system. Without going into too much detail concerning that, what the Gracchi sought to do was to use, in many ways, almost a constitutional loophole, the power of the tribunate, the power of the popular tribunes to pass legislation through the popular assembly and thus negate the authority and the dominance of the Roman Senate. This does not end well. In 133 BC, Tiberius is killed, he's murdered, he's battered to death upon the Capitoline Hill by senators and their followers who had armed themselves with clubs. That's remarkable in the city of Rome. 122 BC, Gaius and a huge number of his followers are again killed. Gaius himself, we believe, is stabbed to death and his body cast into the river Tiber, normally the resting place of thieves, traitors, and their like. So what the Gracchi expose for us is not the demise of the Republic, as some might seek to argue, or its transformation. Instead, they expose the inherent inbuilt weaknesses that are never truly satisfied. They also expose the power of the people, and it's the power of the people that I'm often most drawn to when considering how politics works in the Roman Republic. The idea of the crowd, the idea of the Roman populace exerting influence upon senatorial families and upon senators themselves. It also exposes for us the distinction and opposition between the popular assembly and the authority of the Senate. And as one historian has noted, in many ways this is a curtain raiser for the blood-stained finale of the Roman Republic. Alongside this, there are wider concerns about land and army, property ownership, debt, huge amount of land controlled by small elements of the Roman aristocracy, the Roman highly wealthy Senate. And this then leads to conflicts between Marius and Sulla. I think Sulla is in many ways one of the most important figures in the late Republic, but also someone who, in many ways, in seeking to strengthen the Senate, actually undermines Roman political order. He's most well known for marching his armies twice on the city of Rome, but actually he's much more than that. He was formerly a lieutenant of Marius. He orchestrated the first of the proscriptions, and these were, in one sense, given as a concession to senators and their families, just so they would know who actually was going to be killed. The proscription lists are effectively an encouragement by anyone to attack anyone on that list. In reality, then, it's a list for those that can be killed as enemies of the state. And it's a remarkable thing and a terrible thing that he does. And of course, that's a crucial component of how he destabilizes the Republic. It was more than that, however, with Sulla. And again, as recent research has shown, instead of strengthening or fortifying the Senate, actually what he does is he creates a climate of fear, a terrible climate of fear, whereby actually the punishment, the proscriptions, move far beyond their immediate goal. For instance, in banning the children of those who had been proscribed from pursuing public office, that is a terrible fate to level upon the Roman aristocracy. Property passed to the treasury, but also, and this comes through from a number of sources, it's almost as though there is some kind of slave freedman clone army running across the city of Rome, because he frees so many slaves, they all take his name, and there are all these various Lucius, Cornelius running across the city. So this is anarchy, but it's controlled anarchy in the sense that he is doing it to fortify his position, but also to fortify, in one sense, the Senate. But I would say it fails. Numbers here are always difficult. Some people have argued that in the initial wave, 1,500 people are murdered, and that became 9,000. The Senate ultimately were intimidated by him. He took on, and they offered him the role of dictator. He sought to bolster the legislative power of the Senate. So he stripped, for instance, the tribunate and the popular assembly. But ultimately what he's really doing is kind of legislating against anyone doing what he had done. In 79 BC, he retires into private life quite suddenly, and that private life was infamous, even in the ancient world, for debauchery. And then shortly thereafter, he died. Upon his epitaph, it was alleged that he wished to be written that no friend ever surpassed him in kindness, nor enemy in malice. But what is most important, I think, about Sulla, beyond this, the way in which he destabilizes the Roman Republic, is that at no point now can it return to what it once was. Political violence, which we've seen with the Gracchi, has now been given the full force of almost Roman authority, senatorial authority, and that cannot now be ignored. That is going to be there now forevermore, up until Octavian, up until Augustus. In the same way, however, he has now presented a model for similar-minded figures, people like Pompey, Caesar, Mark Antony, and all the rest. And I think if I were to argue for any moment when the Republic ceases to be, I would argue the Republic as it once was does not survive Sulla. And that actually, at this point, it becomes a shadow, a veneer, a political kind of skeleton of what it once was. And that then leads us into the Great Civil War, where we really see the Republic and any remnant of the Republic being devoured by these rival sides. If we look at this just for a few minutes, what we find ourselves talking about again is Caesar. And I suspect a number of you will know we're quite fortunate to have Caesar's own writings. This can give us, I think, a really useful window into this world. And it can tell us a number of really interesting things, but in particular, when we consider someone like Caesar, if you think about Caesar in Gaul in the 50s BC, or if you think about his own recollection of the civil wars, each of these documents is performative. Each of these documents actually belongs to a wider pattern of the sharing of information, but the control of information. This is perhaps most clearly seen in his version of the Gallic War, his campaign, his war in Gaul. Because if we just think about how it begins, all Gaul is divided into three parts, and then one of which the Belgae, the Aquitani, who we call the Celts, but also the Gauls. That's how it begins. But actually, of course, that's not simply not true. It's actually creating an artificial geography for the Romans, because when he's writing this, he's sending it back and it's being delivered, it's being performed, and it's speaking to the Roman people. So actually, someone like Caesar, before we think even of how he exacerbates the destructive elements of the late Republic, or indeed exposes how the Republic may already be dead and gone, the way he operates and how successful he is in that speaks to the nature of this Roman world. And what he does through his commentaries, which are partly memoirs, partly reports, that give the illusion of objective reportage, but also, of course, of some kind of propaganda, tell us about the role of the Roman people and the importance of the Roman people, and how you could engage with the Roman population through oratory performance, through control of space, through the spending, of course, of money, the distribution of gifts, of land, of grain, and all of the above. But crucially, the power, I think, of the crowd as an audience, but an active audience to the late Roman political worlds. And that leans heavily on a number of different writings, in particular someone like, for instance, Fergus Miller and the crowd in Rome in the late Republic. The Great Civil War is something that's been particularly well discussed. And by this point, I would argue the Republic is a shadow of its former self, a shallow imitation of what it once was and how it was imagined by Roman historians. If we return to something like Lucan, who is, as I said, was this great poet, he presents the individuals involved in a particularly, I think, useful manner. So Caesar, for instance, he imagines as someone who is completely amoral, an amoral embodiment of energy, someone who cannot stop moving, constantly in motion, but also destroying the world around him. Pompey, and I think this is particularly useful and particularly true, emerges as a figure who is actually synonymous with the moribund Republic, a shadow of his former greatness. And then Cato appears as this one-dimensional Stoic saint. And I find that useful because it does match some of the ideas we have about the late Republic and the cycle of civil wars. To close this talk and to think then about questions in history and to think about the demise of the Republic, what I have argued is that actually the Republic in any kind of substantive sense falls with Sulla. And it falls in that period because of what Sulla does, but also because of how it embodies political violence and how it leads into the future military potentates. It's worth remembering and reminding ourselves, everyone, that of course the Republic, strictly speaking, continues after Caesar, after his death. We have the triumviral period, the second triumviral period with Octavian, and then we have Octavian's very gradual, very careful manipulation of the remnants of the Republican governance and his creation basically of a system of government that is focused solely upon him. But alongside this, he also makes the claim that the Republic is restored. And that's important for us because that speaks to contemporary attitudes, but it also tells us, I think, something really crucial about the Republic itself. And that is that the Republic existed on two different levels, on two different layers. On the one hand, it was the political and social realities of Rome up until the 1st century BC. But in another, and perhaps more powerful, it existed in the imagination of the Roman populace, of the Roman aristocracy, of Rome more generally. And so when August and Octavian, and then once he took the name Augustus, once he presented himself as saving the Republic and continued with this grand lie and this illusion that the Republic survives when, of course, it does the very opposite, nonetheless, what he is doing there is engaging with the idea of the Republic. He transforms the Republic into the monarchy, into the empire. He presents this with a veneer of continuity. He offers peace and prosperity. And what he tells us is the terrible power of and linking memory and history. So someone like Velleius Paterculus, for instance, writing in 30 AD, can present and may believe this to be true, that after 20 years the civil wars were ended, foreign wars buried, peace revived, the fury of arms everywhere lulled to sleep. Force was restored to the laws, authority to the courts, and its majesty to the Senate, and the ancient original form of the Republic was brought back. He could believe that, but he could believe it because what Augustus did was to continue with the illusion of republican governance, and he does it carefully. He takes his time accumulating all these different powers, but by the point that he actually dies, there is no real republic. It's been long dead, and I would argue fallen as soon as Sulla marched for the first time and then the second time on the city of Rome. Tacitus, who's writing a little bit later and has his own experience of tyranny and the terrible nature of imperial power that has been unchecked, tells us that Augustus himself seduced the army. He seduced the army by bounties. He seduced the people by free corn, the whole world by the comfort of peace. And then gradually he assumed the power of the Senate, the magistrates, the making of law. There was no opposition, for the bravest of men had fallen in the line of battle, or instead fallen to the prescription lists. And what I'd like to end with today is Lucan once more. He writes during his great epic poem about a lofty oak in a fruitful field, bearing the people's spoils of old and generals' hallowed dedications, something that is clinging with roots no longer strong. By its own weight, it stands firm, and spreading its branches through the air, it makes shade with the trunk, not foliage, and though it totters ready to fall, it alone is venerated. And I end with these words because, of course, that is in reality what the Republic is. It's still there in the minds of contemporaries, but it has been dead and gone for a very long time. Thank you, everyone.